Okay, so my talk is Living in Harmony, DITA and Markdown, and what I want to talk about today is the process of integrating these two different formats, some of the things that work today, some of the challenges, and some of the things to really think about if this is something you want to be doing. So my presentation today is going to go through about 5 different sections, and my goal is to do this whole thing in 25 minutes. So the fact that we're late is not a bad thing. I want to keep this as concise as possible. So I want to do an overview of DITA and Markdown. I want to talk about why we would want to do this. Go through the system architectures that are, probably the most common architectures you'd see when using these two formats together. The current state of the technology and the tools, and then just talk about a few different common goals that people might have for bringing these two together and why you might want to pursue one of those. So first, I want to call this out that I am going to be showing some tools today, and some of those tools are going to be easyDITA. I've never actually done anything demo-wise on the SOAP stage with our tools before. I try to keep my presentations not being sales pitches, and that's not the intention. It's just that you can't really have this conversation without talking about tools. So if I'm going to show tools, I'm going to show mine. All right, so who's this for? Anybody who's seen any of my presentations knows that I almost always start with this. I think this is a really important question. In this particular situation, the obvious answer is people who need DITA and Markdown. But really, who are those people? So I think the most general and common answer to that question is probably it's a B2B company that's got a relatively complex suite of products, active development, those types of things, and probably one that needs an educated user, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. I think I'm probably also going to lean slightly towards software companies in this presentation, and that's really more because that's really where Markdown lives. You don't see a lot of Markdown in hardware companies. Maybe you will in the future, but so far in my experience, you don't. That's not intentional. I just think that that's kind of how that works out. So going back to that thought about an educated user, I think this is a really important point whenever we're discussing formats, infrastructure, ecosystems for content delivery. So as an organization, I feel like this is a question we need to ask ourselves before we go on tools journeys and process journeys and all that kind of stuff. How educated do we need our users to be? Because the reality is that not every organization even wants an educated user. Not every organization's goal is to have a user who is a subject matter expert in the thing that they produce. And really being upfront and honest about where you fall on that spectrum, I think is one of the most important decisions you can make before you start to make format and tools and infrastructure and ecosystem decisions. So I think as a part of this conversation that I want to have around formats and systems, I want to talk about who's that really for, and I think it's for organizations that need an educated user. So when you're thinking about your product, does your product look more like this or more like this? So if your product is option number 1, you probably need an educated user, and then this is going to be really relevant to you. But if your product looks like this, you probably don't really need an educated user, and documentation probably isn't that important. But one of the biggest mistakes I see organizations make is thinking they can produce option number 2 when their product is innately option number 1. Some products, especially in B2B, hardware, software, technology, they are needfully complex. Because if you make them too simple, they lose their value. So being really honest about where you fall on this spectrum is going to impact all the things you do downstream. If you need to train your users, your new customers, to onboard them, to make them proficient in what you're doing, that is going to impact the formats you use to capture your knowledge as you're going through this process. So, it might seem like a funny place to start, but I really do feel like being upfront and honest, knowing that you can't get to the no training, no documentation, perfect intuitive UX for everything. I think it really does matter when you start to choose the rest of the ecosystem that's going to support your users. So, who's this for? It's for those that need an educated user. If this is you, if you really do have a complex product or service that you're delivering and it's better with educated users, then I think you need to be thinking about these more complex ecosystems that combine structured formats like DITA with potentially faster, less structured formats like Markdown. Okay, so let's take a look at those formats now. So Markdown and DITA at a glance. I'm going to kind of assume that everybody in here more or less understands Markdown and DITA at a really high level, but I'm still going to go through it. So the strengths and weaknesses of Markdown are, as I see it, basically these. So Markdown has 3 really strong points. And I think that just because this list is longer, I don't think it makes this unbalanced by any means. I think these are really, really important. So Markdown accelerates really quickly. You can start writing documentation in Markdown right now on your phone. I mean, like, it's just text, it's really easy to set up, and it's really easy to get going with. And because it's designed to be readable in its source format, you can basically publish it without having publishing tools in a really, really rudimentary way. It integrates with code really well because it's just text. It integrates with code technologies really well because it's just text. So like line differencing and those types of things work really well in Markdown. And finally, it's great for developer collaboration. It's kind of the default for developers. Developers like code management systems. They like things that work well with their code management systems. So Markdown is going to integrate well with their current processes. So what you tend to give up with Markdown is kind of the semantics, metadata, and then some of the non-web format publishing capabilities. So you can get PDF out. You can do semantic content a little. You can do metadata, at the head of your documents and things like that. It's never going to be as deep. It's never going to be as capable as a fully structured format like DITA. The other major thing that you give up is pre-render validation. So if you look at large-scale Markdown implementations, one of the biggest troubles they often have is that validating your content can become very difficult, and you have to build a lot of tooling around it. And as you go through that process, because Markdown in some ways is more of a philosophy than an actual tool set, there's so many varieties of it. You're standardized on one thing, but you put plugins and things like that into it. Maintaining these tools can become complex. So as it scales up, these things really start to become evident. Not having any pre-render validation can become an issue at a certain scale in certain ways. Collaborating with non-technical users, so if you have non-developers, non-writers who need to work with your content, Markdown might be very, very easy and intuitive for people who are familiar with it. But for people who expect documents, for people who live in Microsoft Word, it's not. And you can probably train them into it, but day one, it's not going to be super intuitive. And then lastly, you're going to have a volatile ecosystem. So the benefit and the danger of things like Markdown is that because they accelerate so quickly, because they're based on open source tools, because they use these other things that are just kind of open and you can put them together and like, oh, just add this, put this in, okay, we need this, put this in. You end up with a situation where you often have internal resources maintaining these. They're based on open source tool stacks. They're often highly customized, and it can be maintainable, but it is something that has a different maintenance footprint as you scale than things that are open standards, very strongly validated, and vendor supported. So as you scale up, that can become an issue too, but it's not going to really show up day one. Okay, so let's take a look at DITA. So those of you familiar with DITA, I don't think any surprises here. So reusing content as DITA is very robust, very structured, consistent, and standardized mechanisms for reusing content. If you have complex, multi-product, multi-audience filtering reuse, DITA is going to support that to whatever complexity you need to go with it. Multi-product management is often going to be easier in a strongly structured format, really because of bullet one. You can have, if you have the right tool set, really broad collaboration with different audiences, because structured documents have a lot of tools that are going to present that content in a more WYSIWYG way, and that's going to be a little bit more familiar to just whatever your SME in legal or HR or something like that. It's going to look a little bit more natural to them. DITA is Darwin information typing architecture. there's an adaptability to it. So the ability to have a system that has inheritance built into it. So if I need something that is a little bit different, it still inherits back to something that you expect, means that your tools can move at a different pace than your content. And that's huge. So the last 2 points, adaptability and scalable ecosystem, are really based around that. So if you have multiple departments that are all using this content and they have different systems they're putting them out to, even if they're all web, the ability to scale up your semantics, so to make a paragraph that is a specialized paragraph, a note that is a specialized note, to attach it to something else that you might have to use in the future without breaking other publishing pipelines because of inheritance. This adaptability and scalability, these things are really important when you start to grow the footprint and the user base internally for these systems. So what do you give up with DITA? Well, there's implementation overhead. Anybody who's done a DITA implementation knows that you don't just pop open a text editor and start writing DITA. You have to do information modeling, you have to do change management most often. There's a lot of publishing infrastructure that usually has to be customized, all those types of things. So it's not something that just starts day one. There is absolutely a requirement to take and do planning, to go through a process, to train people, and to bring them into this new way of doing things. So that means that it's a bigger decision. And it's not something that's going to ramp really quickly. So if you're on a product team that's ramping really quickly, that can be a blocker for getting into it. There is a tooling requirement with DITA. Sure, you can write DITA in Notepad, but you don't want to. Nobody wants to. It's not going to work. It's not going to scale. It's going to be a disaster. So, there's a lot of benefit in having this structured system, but at the same time, you're going to have probably a vendor-supported tool stack at some level around it. And that means that is another barrier to implementation. It's another thing you have to invest in to get the value out of this. And finally, relative to the types of systems that are typically supporting a Markdown implementation, the DITA ecosystem is going to be slower moving. It's based on the DITA Open Toolkit, on the standard. The standard doesn't rev very fast, kind of by design, because you have these big organizations using the standard. They don't want a new version of it every 6 months, every year. They want something that's very stable. So, that can be, stability is a benefit. Moving slow is an issue. So depending on how you look at that, that can be a problem. So where does DITA work best? DITA works best when you've got a lot of dependencies, a lot of products, a lot of languages, and you have complex requirements. If you have the need to go out to many different things from many different departments and share content between all of these, DITA is going to be something that can support that infrastructure. Markdown works best when you have a single product, a single audience, and a single language, although there are some creative things I've seen people do about language management in Markdown, so I wouldn't say that that's a hard bullet by any means. A single number of outputs. It's very common that Markdown is just going through a static site generator and generating a static website. That works really well in some cases. And then relatively simple metadata requirements. So what I'd really like to see is I'd like to see a world where you can use both of these things, because I think that DITA can be faster with Markdown and Markdown can be more stable with DITA. Because if we're really talking about the benefits of these two systems, that's the benefit. DITA implementations oftentimes will last decades. That's the tool replacement cycle for DITA systems. They will be installed and stay installed and producing value for 10 or more years. Markdown implementations can start in under a week. So these two things, they're not competitive. They really can live together and they can benefit from each other. And that's my why. But the other half of my why is the product lifecycle. And the thing we go through with products is that products start as prototypes. They start in small teams, agile teams. Our product development teams can be just broken off from larger teams to build these new things. Are they going to work? Are they going to go to market? Are they just experimentation? You don't always know when they start. You don't want to go and do a DITA implementation for those things. It doesn't make any sense. So what you see in a lot of places is that as you're ramping up a new product, and there's a lot of question marks around it. Is it viable? Is it going to work? You still need to create documentation. It just doesn't make sense to bring that into the infrastructure overhead and the process that comes with the DITA implementation. So oftentimes Markdown is better there. But as these products mature, they're naturally going to become more complex. And again, talking about mostly B2B type products. They're going to become more complex as users and customers request new things, as they grow to support new use cases, as their ecosystem builds out. Almost every product that's brought to market in B2B over time will have features added to it, will have complexity added to it, and that's all going to require knowledge. Also, they tend to break apart. So one product might become a family of products, and those family of products might then be split off and combined with other products to come back together. So this life cycle of products can be very complex. And when you have to manage content that could be for multiple products, it could be coming back together for a single product, it could have rebranding, it could have all these different types of things, DITA really shines there. So if you can start quickly with a low infrastructure overhead, and then you can move into something which is going to adapt with the product lifecycle over time, I see that as being a really big benefit. And I kind of think about it this way. So for our products, knowledge doesn't have a source format. But all of our systems are going to work better or worse depending on the source formats we use. And we use systems to manage and deliver all of our knowledge. So what this really means is that there's no way to separate the conversation around systems and knowledge. We have to look, systems and format. We have to look at our knowledge requirements and how we're delivering them, and then we have to make decisions around what formats we're going to use and how they're going to integrate with our systems. So this integration is a story of systems. It's not just a story of formats. All right, now on to the technical slides. This is probably the fun part for a lot of people in here. So I'm going to talk about different architectures. I want to talk about what works today. I want to talk about what still needs some work. All right. So I think there's three primary architectures. I think you basically have a single repository, you have multiple repositories where one is pushing content in a single direction, and then I think you have bidirectional repositories where you have two or more repositories sharing content, and the content is moving back and forth between them. So a single repository kind of looks like this. You have your writers and your developers. They're all working in a single system, and they're updating, creating, managing, and publishing out of this one system. So this is the simplest case from a systems perspective. But being realistic, in an ongoing implementation, this probably isn't very common. Developers are very rarely going to want to be in a CCMS, and CCMSs aren't often designed for Markdown content or text content like that. And on the flip side, writers can manage DITA in GitHub or in version control systems, but there's some issues there too because they lack the validation and some of the other tooling around link management and things like that that really make it easier to scale content inside of those systems. So from a pure systems perspective, this is easiest. From a user's perspective, this is oftentimes not optimal. So we can look at the second option. We have one way with multiple repositories one way. So in this case, what we kind of have here is we've got a Git system. I've got the GitHub logo here, and we've got a CCMS system over here. Of course, I've got our logo. And in this case, people are maintaining their Markdown in the Git system, and the Markdown is flowing into the CCMS. The benefit of this is that you get limited reuse. You get the ability to publish these things together, and in that way, you're able to reuse it. So, if they end up in the same system, why is the reuse limited? We're going to touch on this a little bit more in a minute, but what it really comes down to is that reuse inside of all systems is basically addressing based, so you have to be able to find the content to reuse it. And if you're reusing content more granularly than at the topic or article level or file level, however you want to say it, so if you're reusing like code blocks or sections or whatever those may be, those things need to be ID'd. They need to be addressed. And if it's only going one way, you don't have the option to apply those here because they're not stable. So unless you have really well accepted and practiced processes, you're pretty much stuck with topic level reuse in this one-way system. which isn't bad. It might be enough for what you're doing. Depending on your workflow, depending on your user group, this might actually work. But it is a limitation of this. So with this, I want to get to my first video, because I want to oh, sorry, I was supposed to be on the slide a minute ago. Oops. In this situation, this is basically the architecture, at a more systems level. So you have a Git system over here. You have a middleman system in the middle. And this is because the way that most web architectures work today, it's better to put something in the middle and use both of their APIs and directly connect to them. Direct connections tend to be fragile because people rev their APIs and you got to maintain them, and then the vendor changes it and you don't really hear about it, and vendors don't always work together really well. So having a system in the middle that can have more stability in which versions of APIs it's using and is vendor independent, I think is really important. So if anybody's going to do a connection like this, not even if it's between these two systems, I'd recommend this particular architecture. And this is relatively simple because there's just two operations. This middleman has to clone a branch from GitHub and then put the files into easyDITA. And that's all caps because that is an HTTP put for those of you who want to get really technical. So this is going to show that architecture that I just discussed. So if we could push play. What we're going to see is we've got a folder here in easyDITA. We're going to click over to GitHub. We're actually going to kind of navigate down through this just to show what we're looking at. This is a set of files. The files don't really matter in this case. This is completely agnostic to which files go through this process. Here what we're doing is we're running a middleman command. So this is a system that's actually running on my laptop. It could be anywhere. It could be any of your systems could run this. It's just taken all those files, it's run them. If we refresh, we'll see that those files have now been checked out and migrated over into easyDITA. So it's a pretty simple process. And all it really takes is having this one system sitting between these two things. And we're actually, the code that's running behind this, that middleman code, is open source. So if anybody wants to use it for this or any other application, you can come see me and I'll give you the link. So that process actually isn't that complicated. And what you end up with is your files being synced one direction between these two systems. So that works. That's something that you can do today. Okay, so this is probably the one that you guys think about more often. It's just bidirectional repositories. So you've got Markdown flowing in and out of these two systems. It's totally shared. And this one, if you have the middleman set up, is going to look like this. This is more complex, and we're going to come back to that in a minute, but this presents a number of challenges that are a little bit more difficult to overcome, but not impossible. Okay, so let's move on to what works today from a technical perspective. So the first thing we want to look at is publishing together. So this is one of the things that I think is very common. You have Markdown, you have DITA, you want to put them out to the same, the same output. So what we're going to see here is we have a DITA map and we have a Markdown file. Here is the Markdown file, just to see what it looks like quickly. If we are going to close this Markdown file, we're going to drag it into the DITA map. And then we just have to tell DITA that it is in fact Markdown. So we go and we set the format to Markdown. That could actually be automated, but it isn't for this demo. And then we're going to go and we're going to publish this system, or this set of content as DITA in Markdown. And this is just running the DITA Open Toolkit 3.2.1. So even though this is easyDITA here, it's just running the vanilla DITA Open Toolkit. So there's nothing really all that special there. So this takes about 15 seconds to publish. Through the magic of video editing, it takes 5 seconds. And we end up with this publish right here. And we can see that we just jump in and grab this PDF. And lo and behold, we have a guide with Markdown there and DITA there. So that's really the entire process of integrating DITA and Markdown into a single publishing environment. It is effectively out of the box. It really isn't that difficult today. Publishing together with element level reuse. So this is getting to the point where you can start to really integrate these things. So like the situation that I always think of for this is your developers are going to write code examples and they're going to put them in code blocks. And you're going to want to be able to use that in a lot of different places. And you're going to want those things to be updated when they're updated. So if you can sync these two things up so developers can write code blocks in what they want to write them in, and you can use those code blocks where they need to actually be put in front of people, other than just reference. So if you have need for guides or training or support materials or any of the other spectrum of knowledge deliverables that you may have, this becomes really, really useful. So let's look at publishing together using element level reuse, because this is actually pretty simple today too. So I'm going to pop open this Markdown file again, and what you're going to see that we're doing here is we're going to be putting just a tag on here to tell this to be a section. You can do the same thing with the examples and code blocks, and then we put an ID on it there. It says org content. And then I open up the DITA source in this particular case because it's a little more visual. And we put a section in, put a conref in, and we just put in the reference. We save this, and we go back through the publishing process for this. So it's the same publishing process. You just put just putting the regular values in, clicking publish here, and once again, this takes about 15 seconds in real time. And we can see that this conref is going to have resolved for us. So we dropped it at the end of this important tables document, and there it is. That's the organization content pulled out of the Markdown file. So the ability to publish content together at the element level also works. So that feels like pretty good integration at this point, right? The last thing that works today that is actually a little surprising to me, but it does work, is round tripping. You can convert lightweight DITA to Markdown. You can convert Markdown to DITA, which means that theoretically these could be format independent. They could just be content or knowledge. So let's look at what that looks like. All right, so here what we're going to do is we're just going to open up the Markdown. You know, this is kind of like a nothing in the hat type of a thing. See that that's what we have here. We're going to go back to the publish. And this time we're going to use the convert Markdown to DITA. And all this really is just specifying the trans type as DITA right there. And the DITA is going to, it effectively normalizes content down to DITA. This goes the other direction too, but this was actually the harder direction. So we go ahead and we publish that. We download the package, which is going to have all the content in it. And then just going to re-upload it to take a look at what it looks like. With a little bit more work, you could have it actually just save automatically into the repository, but it was late and I didn't want to do that. So here is our Markdown file, and we can see that it is in fact just DITA content now. So we can publish together, we can reuse at the element level, we can convert between these two things, so it all just works? Well, no, obviously not. So now we kind of come back to you know, what works out of the box? A single repository, standard reuse, and DITA open publishing, DITA open toolkit publishing. If these are the things you want to do, this works. This is a system that you can stand up today and you can start using, and it probably works inside of whatever tool sets you have. But what really needs work are these two things. So the major challenges are multiple repositories, as I kind of alluded to earlier, and publishing tool change other than the DITA open toolkit. Now, publishing tool chains other than the DITA open toolkit, it's really just a matter of engineering to get those things to work. They're both well understood formats. They're both structured enough. You know, there's good tools around them. So I don't see this as being something that can really block an implementation. It's just a matter of engineering, and it's all pretty straightforward. But this one's really kind of the elephant in the room. These multiple repositories create a problem. And the reality is that this conversation around formats really does come back to this conversation around systems, because formats like DITA, so structured formats, work better in systems that understand structured formats, and formats like Markdown, which are text-based, work better in text-based systems like GitHub. So you have to find a way to bring these two things together if you're going to have that fully collaborative multi-system environment. So, you know, another way of putting that is that this one is the challenge. This is the thing that's really going to be difficult. There are things that can be done here. You can use checksumming. You can use different processes for managing merges and bringing the content back together. You can limit what you're doing. So a great example is if you're only applying IDs just to enable reuse to your content, that's going to be a much simpler system. But the reason I really want to call this out is that this gets more into process and how you work together as a team than it does into pure technology. The demo I showed before with the middleman, that effectively does this. It does round trip the content if nobody's working on it all the time. But if you have people merging things together and you have like changes in both places and you've got conflicts and like resolving those things becomes an issue, and you can't necessarily solve that issue with just systems. You have to think about those issues as process issues. So, you know, it's kind of, I don't have a great answer for this because your answer is going to be different for everyone. So quickly, I just want to talk through so this is really what that is. You want Git for developers and you want a CCMS for writers. And this is hard. It's not going to be something that is solved overnight, and it's going to be solved differently for everybody. So what kind of implementation do you need? I think these are the big questions. Like, where do these things fit together? What are they supporting? How does it fit together? Like, how does it actually come together into being knowledge for your customers? So let's talk about a couple of different goals, and I will quickly, because I've actually ended up taking more time than I wanted to, discuss how these can work. So this efficient handoff is interesting because this is actually, under the covers, this is actually the single system. If you have a product team that when they get to a certain point, they roll the product into the main maintenance process, and you just have to hand the markdown off, it's a single system. It's super simple. The whole thing just works. So this is actually something that basically works out of the box today. If Markdown is your acceleration format and DITA is your maintenance format, you can do this. Unified documentation is actually pretty much working today. So if you have the right process around how you're going to ID things, how you're going to structure things, how you're going to maintain things, and how everyone's going to work together, you can do this. You can put out documentation which is written in multiple source formats and comes together for a single experience for your end users. And this looks a lot like the second architecture in most cases, because what you're doing is you're pushing this content together and then you're using a common rendering engine. The integration with like support and learning, so basically cross-department collaboration, this one gets a little bit more complex. It can look like architecture 1 or like architecture number 2, or excuse me, architecture 2 or 3. It can look like either of those two. It depends on how you're implementing this, but this can be one of the major goals. And I think when you have this actual collaboration across departments, that's your goal, this is when you need to start to sit down and think about drawing this out, putting it on the whiteboard, getting everyone to agree to process those types of things. So I think that this is a little bit more complex, but I also think this can be largely doable. And finally, content scalability. So this in a lot of ways is similar to the rest of them rolled together into a single strategy. I think what we all really want is to be able to deliver value long term. And I think we need to think about how our content needs to scale as our product changes. And I think that this is something that we see a lot of teams that they kick that can down the road. So in a lot of ways, deciding what your infrastructure is going to look like in 3 years and how these things are going to come together and what your main mode of operation is going to be, it really comes down to this question in the long run. So I put this in here because this is something that I think about a lot, and it's one of the things that drove me to this talk, and it's one of the things that I find to be most interesting. So if you're having issues around scaling content, you're running into deliverables that you can't put out, you're finding situations where collaboration or review processes like that are taking longer than they should, maybe it's time to take a look backwards into your systems, into your format, and decide if there's a better way to support this scalability. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Guys, any questions to Patrick? I can't really see you. There's one here, one up there, maybe more.
I have a question about are you planning to integrate this middleware with your easyDITA, for example, to make it easier for the users?
So integrate is a funny and kind of loaded question there. The short answer is no, but that's by design. So what we're planning on doing is making it better and giving it to you. Because the thing is, like, this same middleware works for taking stories out of Jira and turning them into small DITA topics and then running that through your publishing pipeline, integrating with Confluence, integrating with Zendesk. Like, you can use this middleware to push and pull content from any other system. All it really has to do is understand the different APIs. So what we've done is we've created basically a package that understands easyDITA's APIs from both like a selection and an update mechanism, and then we've created some patterns that should make the process of getting that content in and out from other systems a little bit easier. And then we're going to rely on our customers to implement it however they really want.
Okay, thank you.
There was one more question right there. Could you put your hand up? Yep.
Hello, this is Martin from ABB. You mentioned the easyDITA limitations being overhead, one of them being overhead, and I'm actually seeing more overhead now with merging Markdown and DITA. And the second question, I'm seeing a cultural challenge also, because you seem to have an idea of merging two different working cultures, and that might be a challenge. Those two different crowds of people, they will need to work together, cooperate. And are you seeing that as a challenge? Thanks.
So yes. So I think the first part of the question, the overhead, I want to be specific that there's overhead in both systems. What I was calling out was the implementation overhead. So it's the cost of implementing. The overhead you're going to have in your system is whatever the format is, whatever the technologies are, built on a whole bunch of different factors, and you can have that in any source format. In terms of the cultural challenges, the goal here is to kind of tell people you don't have to be fighting about the format. Because if you look at a lot of like the chatter that happens, it's like DITA versus Markdown. And I understand why that's kind of appealing, because like you want to have your team and you want your team to win, but the reality is it just doesn't need to be that way. And systems that are built to run together and teams that come together in order to focus on a goal and use their technologies and their tools where their tools should be used, I think are the ones that really make sense. One of the things that I kind of thought of and I didn't put in here was this analogy that Markdown is kind of like a shovel and DITA is like a backhoe. And you have these people who've never used a backhoe who are like, that's way too complex. Why would you ever want to do that? And then you have people who are, construction workers who build big buildings, and they're like, why would you ever use a shovel? Like, you can't build a big building with a shovel. And if you're going to run it, if you're going to start a project by yourself and you don't know how to operate a backhoe, a shovel looks like the obvious answer. We've all used a shovel, but like, who in here has ever used a backhoe, right? So they're just different. Like, there's a place in the world for both of them, and any construction site that's building something sufficiently large is going to have both of them there, and you don't have people arguing about whether or not we should eliminate shovels or backhoes. So that's kind of how I think about this, and I think that that's where we need to get culturally, as opposed to discussing the benefits of the formats in their own little worlds.
Okay, we have one more question, and let's agree that this will be the last question.
So hi, Ludovico again. So you mentioned in one of your first slides that one of the pros of DITA is the semantics that you can apply to information, right? So all the metadata. Is there a way, because then we saw all this movement, between the two containers, one with Markdown and DITA on the other hand. So is there a way to actually put this data into the Markdown files and to keep this metadata when we move information files around? And or are we going to have like a mixed system where we have some documentation with a lot of semantics applied to it and other parts that are just more plain?
So broadly speaking, yes, but also you already have a mixed system where some has more semantics and some doesn't. Like no matter what your format is, there is some content that requires more semantics and some that requires less. So like even in a DITA system, a topic that's mostly just paragraphs has less semantics than a task which has choices and all those types of things that might be feeding into more advanced rendering mechanisms. So there's the formats aren't what's dictating the semantics requirements for the individual pieces of content there. That's going to exist regardless. But also, yes, you can transmit some metadata back and forth. Semantics get a little harder in Markdown. It's not that it's impossible to put semantics in Markdown, but it's more challenging because of the lack of inheritance and how that works. So it's a little bit more difficult to sustain it. Whereas like the inheritance piece in DITA is what allows that to like grow more organically, but also be without wrecking your current systems that are in place. So it's kind of a, I don't know, it's kind of a jumbled answer, and it's a longer conversation that, I mean, I could talk to you about for hours, so.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.